Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and in this video I'm going to talk about propositions 154 through 158 in Proclus's Elements of Theology. And I think by now anyone watching this probably knows that this video is part of a series of videos, and I will link the playlist here. And as I've been doing throughout the series, I am using the E.R. Dodds translation. And as always, there is a PDF link in the description box. In my last video, I talked about propositions 151 through 153. And there, Proclus highlighted 3 different divine functions. In today's video, we're going to see a number of other divine functions. And it starts with proposition 154, which reads, "All that is protective in the gods preserves each principle in its proper station, so that by its unitary character it transcends derivative existences and is founded upon the primals." So now Proclus is focusing on the providential divine power of protecting or preserving. I will jump into the description now to see how Proclus describes this. So as you can see here, Proclus starts off with an if-then statement. And the if part here, he's actually going to define what he means by divine protection. Divine protection immutably maintains the measure of the station assigned to each, and it conserves in their proper perfection all the objects of its care. So what the divine protection does is it maintains what he calls here the measure of the station. But what does it mean to maintain the measure of the station? Well, this is actually a reference to proposition 117. So this is one that I have referred back to many times. Every god is a measure of things existent. The gods as onenesses are the measure of all number. In other words, they determine where each participant in their series is situated. Being of a higher number means being more differentiated, and so later in the series. Being more unified means being closer to the monad. So the protective gods determine the station of each existent. And notice the verbs here: maintain, conserve, and they carry out this function immutably, without change. And here is what follows. If this is true as the definition of divine protection, then it implants in all a superiority to lower principles. It sets each in steadfast independence without alien admixture, for it has the property of causing in its objects an uncontaminated purity, and lastly founds the being of each upon the principles superior to it. The idea of purity is going to come up later, so hold on to that. But what Proclus is showing us here is that this is the result of each existent maintaining its proper station. There is a hierarchy. There is nothing at all like human social hierarchies, of course. Those have their pros and their cons, but that's beyond the topic of this discussion. Here we are looking solely at metaphysical hierarchies, which are only good. Everything is in its proper station. Even at the lower end of the hierarchies, our physical world, all is precisely what it is. It is good and right in its own proper station. For the perfection of any existent consists in its laying fast hold of the primals, remaining steadfast in its own being, and preserving the simplicity by which it transcends the lower. Notice the vocabulary used throughout this proposition. This is all the language that we use to refer to the abiding or the remaining term in a triad, the first in the triad. And this highest term is analogous to the transcendent being of the triad, the unparticipated cause that pre-embraces its resultants. And I've gone back to Proposition 67 many times, so I'm sure you're familiar with this. The hyparxis, or the top of the triad, is the whole before the parts, and the forms are pre-existing in the cause here. Okay, now I'll go on to Proposition 155. And here Proclus is talking about the life-giving, or what he's translating here as zygonic function of the gods. All that is zygonic or life-giving in the divine kinds is a generative cause, but not all the generative order is zygonic, for the generative is the more universal and near to the first principle. So much as we saw that the preserving gods are analogous to the hyparxis of the triad, we are seeing here that the zygonic, or the life-giving gods, are in the train of the generative gods in the middle of the triad. And Dodds gives us the term life-giving as a definition of zygony. Zygony is a word I've never heard before, and I imagine some of you are not familiar with it either. Thomas Taylor uses the word vivific. I find that is more helpful, so I'm going to plug that in from time to time. But going back to the proposition, Proclus tells us that these middle gods are in the order of generative gods, but are subsequent to the generative gods of Proposition 152. Remember, the more universal causes are higher in the metaphysical hierarchy. And that is Proposition 126. A god is more universal as he is nearer to the one, more specific in proportion to his remoteness from it. For generation signifies that cause which advances existence to plurality, but zygony, or the vivific cause, describes the divinity which bestows all life. And so this is why Dodds also called them life-giving. If then the former of these multiplies the number of substantive existences, while the latter constitutes the successive orders of life, then the generative order will be related to the zygonic series as being is to life. And so Proclus is setting up this analogy. The generative is to the zygonic or vivific as being is to life. This may at first seem confusing because we had placed both the generative and the zygonic gods as analogous to the preceding term, or analogous to life. It was here in Proposition 101 that Proclus showed the classic triad of being, and then life, and then intellect. It looks something like this. But what Proclus is doing here in Proposition 155 is relating these two divine functions in the model of a triad within a greater triad. Something like this. So even though the generative was placed in the middle of the higher triad constructed in the last set of propositions that I covered in my last video, it ranks as the hyparxis here, or the fullest flowering of this generative order. And so it will therefore be the more universal and productive of more numerous effects, and for this reason it will be near to the first principle. And there again is Proposition 101, being and then life and then intellect. And the higher terms are near to the first principle. And I will just wrap this up by reminding you of Proposition 60. Whatever principle is the cause of a greater number of effects is superior to that which has a power limited to fewer objects and which gives rise to parts of those existences constituted by the other as wholes. All right, Proposition 156. Now we're looking at purity. All that is the cause of purity is embraced in the protective order, but not all the protective is conversely identical with the purificatory. I opened this video with Proposition 154, which introduced the protective gods. And let me just scroll up for a moment here. We saw that these protective gods were described with a lot of the same language that was used to describe the abiding or remaining term of a triad. Words like steadfast and maintaining and conserving. We also saw that these protective gods carry out their providential function transcendently. Also, the idea of purity was introduced here. I had asked you to hold on to that. Well, now Proclus is ready to address it. So let me scroll back down. And you can see in the italicized part that purity is contained within the protective order, but the protective order is wider than only the function of purifying. Therefore, protecting is more universal. It is metaphysically prior to purifying. And the explanation starts off, for the divine purity isolates all the gods from inferior existences and enables them to exercise providence towards secondary beings without contamination. Proclus is giving us here a definition of divine purity. First, it isolates all the gods from inferior existences. It gives them transcendence, in other words. Remember, the gods are able to exercise providence while always remaining transcendent. And this was introduced in Proposition 122. All that is divine both exercises providence towards secondary existences and transcends the beings for which it provides. Its providence involves no remission of its pure and unitary transcendence. Neither does its separate unity annul its providence. In fact, it is because the gods never experience declension from the unity which is their substance that they have filled all things with their power. So now we see that Proclus calls the divine function that allows for this transcendence divine purification. So that is the first thing that divine purity does. And the second, you can see, is connected to this. Through that isolation, the gods are able then to exercise providence without being dragged down into those lower energies, without contamination. And this we can see being imitated on a human level by someone like Socrates, who was able to go down into the cave and interact with people of all different degrees of philosophical awareness, and to do so without losing the clarity of his own insights into the self and the reality that unfolds from it. And so, as something of a side note to this proposition, Socrates is an example of someone who was as godlike as is humanly possible. But going back to the text, Proclus now goes on to define divine protection. Divine protection has, besides, the further task of maintaining all things in their proper being and of founding them securely upon the higher principles. So Proclus is including here all that is divine purity, but he is adding a further function, maintaining all things in their proper being. So each is exactly what it is, as we saw in Proposition 154. And founding them securely upon the higher principles. Likeness, remember, is what links one term to the next, and each series flows from its proper cause. Back in Proposition 28, we saw that every producing cause brings into existence things like to itself before the unlike. So likeness is what links one term to the next. Thus, the protective is more universal than the purificatory. The distinctive office of protection, as such, is to keep each thing in the same station relatively to itself and its priors, no less than to its consequence. That of purity, to liberate the higher from the lower. So Proclus is clarifying here the distinction that he sees between the purificatory function and that of the protective. And in mythology, by the way, you can see these functions in the way the gods interact with one another. A different function, a different god. Virginity is generally symbolical of this purificatory function, and so all of the virgin goddesses are goddesses of purity. And these offices belong primitively to the gods. For any general character must have a single antecedent cause. And this is the principle that Proclus was referring to there. Every order has its beginning in a monad and proceeds to a manifold coordinate therewith, and the manifold in any order may be carried back to a single monad. And it is true universally that in the gods the unitary measures of all things good are pre-embraced, and nothing good is found in secondary existences which does not presubsist in the gods. What other source or cause could it have? These functions are all providential, and so they are tied to the gods, being of the order of the good, which was first introduced back in Proposition 119. And this is the one that reads, "The substance of every god is a supra-existential excellence. He has goodness neither as a state nor as part of his essence, for both states and essences have a secondary and remote rank relatively to the gods. But he is supra-existentially good." So if the first principle is both the one and the good, then the gods are not only onenesses, but also goodnesses. And Proclus ends the proposition by saying, "Purity, then, being a good, belongs primitively to the gods, and so also protection and other like offices." So again, all of the functions of the gods are providential. And now we've gotten to Proposition 157. This is a good one. There's a lot going on here. "Whereas it is the function of all paternal causes to bestow being on all things and originate the substantive existence of all that is, it is the office of all demiurgic and formal causes to preside over the bestowal of form upon things composite, the assignment of their stations, and their numerical distinction as individuals. The demiurgic is thus in the same succession as the paternal, but is found in the more specific orders of gods." Proclus is giving us a lot of information right here in the italicized part. He is distinguishing the difference between the terms paternal and demiurgic. There is a great deal of discussion about this in Proclus's Theology of Plato, by the way, and I would highly recommend any Platonist who has not read that book to add it to your reading list. And if you have read it, I recommend reading it again. But an introduction to this topic of paternal versus demiurgic is here, and so this is a nice place to start. Definitions are given to us right here in the italicized part. About paternal causes, he says that they bestow being on all things and originate the substantive existence of all that is, which is a fancy way of saying that the paternal cause is the cause of things having being. Of the demiurgic or formal causes, he says that they preside over the bestowal of form upon things composite, the assignment of their stations, and their numerical distinction as individuals. So these are the jobs or the functions of the demiurgus. Bestowing form on things composite implies that those things already exist. They have being, and now intellectual form or eidos is being added. The demiurgos is also the intellect who determines the station and the number of each in a given series. And so looking again at the last part of this sentence, it says that the demiurgic is thus in the same succession as the paternal, but is found in the more specific orders of gods. And so this idea of universal versus specific is again being used here to determine the ranking of each of these functions in the metaphysical hierarchy. Paternal ranks higher than demiurgic. Okay, so the explanation, it starts off, for both these causes are ranked under the principle of limit, since existence has, like number and form, a limitive character. In this respect, the two are in the same succession. If you were to make a list of all that is ranked under limit and all that is ranked under infinity, being would be under limit and life under infinity, and all the terms that are linked with each of these, being and life, would follow accordingly. And so here we are seeing that the paternal and the demiurgic are each in that highest order. But the demiurgic advances the creative office into plurality, while the other, without departure from unity, originates the processive orders of things existent. So, restating the distinction that was made in the italicized sentence, the paternal never departs unity, but the demiurgic power takes that unity and proceeds it into multitude. Back when I first introduced the paternal cause, I tied it to Proposition 23, and that comes to mind again here. The paternal term proceeds as a unity. It gives something of itself, but that something it gives is a monad, and then that monad that it gives then spreads form to its subsequents. So then we can see the paternal cause is like this unparticipated monad, and the demiurgus is like the participated monad. And again, Proclus goes on, the one creates form, the other existence. So very succinct and clear. As being then differs from form, so does the paternal from the demiurgic. Now Proclus is taking these two terms that both are ranked under the principle of limit, and he is making a triad out of it. This is very much like what he did with the generative and the life-giving powers. He hasn't named the middle term here, but he is telling us the two extremities. So the analogy would be, being is to form as the paternal is to the demiurgic. If we were to label a triangle diagram, being would be at the top. And form has the relationship to being of the intellectual activity of that which is. So using being and form as the analogs for the paternal cause and the demiurgic, we can see this relationship between them. Now, form is a particular kind of being. This relationship is further spelled out in the corollary to Proposition 74. And here I'm going to focus just on the highlighted section of the corollary, that wholeness occupies a mean station between being and the forms. It follows that being is prior also to the forms, and that the forms are existent things, but not every existent is a form. Now this particular proposition was dealing with wholeness, and so we're seeing that here. Being in this relationship would be the unity of the triad. Wholeness is the procession that has not yet differentiated, and the differentiated all is where the distinctive forms make their home. I do talk about this a bit more in a recent video I did on Platonic terminology, so I'll link that at the end of this video. And to wrap this proposition up, Proclus writes, accordingly, the paternal, being the more universal and more comprehensive cause, transcends the demiurgic order, as being transcends form. And now in Proposition 158, Proclus is going on to the elevative gods, and he's going to compare them to the purificatory and introduce another kind of gods, the conversive. So Proposition 158 reads, all elevative causes among the gods differ both from the purificatory causes and from the conversive kinds. So yet another divine function. And in mythology, remember, a different function warrants a different god. And so now we are looking at what Proclus is calling here the elevative gods. In other contexts, these gods have been called anagogic. And the explanation starts off, for it is evident that this cause also must be found primitively in the gods, since all causes of all goods presubsist there. So this elevating function then is providential. But it is prior to the purificatory, which liberates from the lower principles, whereas the elevative effects conjunction with the higher. Let me pause there for a moment. The hierarchy we can see is being laid out. The elevative gods are prior to the purificatory gods. And then Proclus goes on to say that on the other hand, the elevative god has a more specific rank than the conversive, since anything which reverts may revert either upon itself or upon the higher principle. And I'm going to pause there again, because here Proclus is introducing the conversive gods, and we see that they are prior to the elevating gods, and their function is to convert or revert, which is the word Platonists generally prefer. They revert souls to self-knowledge and to their higher causes. So the order of divine functions presented in this proposition then is conversive gods, then the elevating gods, and then the purificatory gods. So these conversive gods are the highest of the three types of gods mentioned here in Proposition 158. Whereas the function of the elevative cause, which draws the reverting existence upwards to what is more divine, is characterized only by the latter mode of reversion. So here we finally get a definition of what the elevative gods do. They draw the reverting existence upwards to what is more divine. So these are theurgic gods. Whenever you're reading or contemplating or meditating, for example, and you feel inspired, these are the gods that are drawing you upwards. They are prior to the purificatory, and so this is why meditation and other forms of theurgic practices are so very important. So now in understanding how these gods function, we are looking at the return, the journey up, if you will. The efforts you make result in some degree of purification, and that purification opens you to ever more profound levels of this elevating inspiration. And then, the next step of the puzzle that Proclus is giving us here is that these elevative gods deliver you to the conversive gods, which revert you deeper into self. And so now we've seen the main functions of the gods. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to write to me either an email or in the comments section. And any other comment, please leave that below. And also, if you enjoy this, you find it helpful, please give it a like and think about subscribing if you don't already. You'll get notifications then when new videos come out. And I do hope that you will join me next time. Thank you very much.